Hello everybody. Thank you for tuning in. This could be the most important thing you ever hear in your life. For some of you, this will be the most important thing you ever hear. This will change or save your life or the life of someone you love. This could be a quantum leap forward for the human experience, as revolutionary as written language or agriculture. I'm talking about trauma, specifically our understanding of trauma. The thing is, come to find out, everything is trauma. Depression, anxiety, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, dissociation, attachment disorder, chronic illness, chronic pain, anger, desperation for attention or affection. All these things are simply symptoms of trauma. All the things we diagnose and medicate and wring our hands about, all those things we suffer from or watch people we love suffer from, all these things that have been kicking humanity's butt forever, they are all simply symptoms of trauma. And so far in human history, we have not addressed the cause, just the symptoms, which of course will not get any better until the cause is addressed. And that is exactly what we have seen, right? We don't have less anxiety in the world, we have more, in spite of all the attention we have given it, all the research, medication, therapy. We don't have less addiction each year. All those things I mentioned earlier seem to get worse year after year. That is how prevalent and powerful trauma is. That is how much of an impact it has on us. The leading trauma researchers now tell us that trauma is the single greatest public health issue on the planet. The number of people living with trauma is huge. In fact, it is likely that you watching this video are living with symptoms of trauma. And equally sad, are spreading that trauma, innocently, unintentionally. Almost everything is trauma. We can do a simple test. Think of yourself and think of the people you know. How many of those have one of those symptoms? Do you or anyone you know struggle with depression, anxiety, ADHD, anger, chronic illness, chronic pain, or any of those other symptoms? Do you know anyone that seems stuck in the past? They just can't seem to get past an event or a time from back in their life. It is possible that you and every person you thought of, every person in your life, is suffering from a symptom of trauma. And that is exactly how widespread it is. That is exactly how huge of an issue this is. Essentially, everyone is suffering from the effects of trauma and desperately need help. Here's an indicator of how prevalent trauma is. At least one of the leading researchers has said it is impossible to have an addiction without trauma. So think of all the people you know that have an addiction. Think of the people you know, perhaps yourself, who struggle with alcoholism or drugs or prescription medication or overworking. That's an actual addiction, or eating problems, or those sort of things. You probably know a lot of people who struggle with addiction. Apparently, that's trauma. There's a line from the song Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen that says, "You end up like a dog that's been beat too much till you spend half your life just covering up." But Bruce is being generous or poetic. because you and I know people who spend their entire lives covering up the turmoil inside. You and I know 80-year-olds who are still very much in the grip of the effects of childhood trauma. And I must interrupt myself here to make an important point for parents. When a parent begins to learn that everything is trauma, and all these disorders and ailments and behaviors are symptoms of trauma, a parent has one of two responses to that. One, a parent feels overwhelming guilt and anguish. What have I done? I've caused my child to suffer. The other response a parent might have is immediately, reflexively, subconsciously, some form of, I dare not be questioned. And it is either from panic and brokenness and fear. A lot of people have that knee-jerk reaction of, it's not my fault, it's not my fault, right? I talk a lot more about this in my series on parenting, but it's like emotional hot potato. It's not my fault. No, get this blame away from me. Get this responsibility away from me. Nope, 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 nope. Right? You and I know people like that. Or they have the response, I dare not be questioned, because of their own narcissism. I am never wrong. I never need to apologize. No one dare question me or what I do. I will never admit a mistake, no matter how great the cost, even if my child's life is at stake. But if your child has symptoms of trauma, first of all, welcome to the club. Welcome to planet Earth. Welcome to parenting. As a parent, you will make mistakes. Perfect parenting is not expected, and it is not the goal. I talk a lot more about that in my series on parenting. And second of all, there's only one proper response for a parent when they begin to learn about trauma, and that is compassion for yourself. Be compassionate with yourself. Experience the absolute magical power of compassion. Eve Ensler said, the only salvation is kindness. Eve is one of the most powerful and inspiring examples of what this whole video is about. Compassion and kindness for yourself. Think of that scene in the movie Good Will Hunting. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. In fact, go look up that scene on YouTube right now and watch it. There's a language advisory, but go check that out and then come back here. Okay, show compassion and kindness to yourself. Do you have any of these symptoms of trauma? Hint, the answer is yes. Acknowledge your own trauma. Find help for yourself. I talk about treatment near the end of this video. Forgive yourself. Then you can help your child. That is what is so exciting, truly exciting, about our relatively new understanding of trauma, is we know how to treat it and we know how to prevent it. We can truly help our children when we are compassionate with ourselves and address trauma. Okay, back to the show. That was an important interruption. I was talking about how so many of the things we suffer from are simply symptoms of trauma. We don't have a homeless problem. We have a trauma problem. We don't have a depression problem, or an anxiety problem, or ADHD, or any of those other things. What we do have is a trauma problem, and it's pretty huge. All the latest research by the most well-known, most respected, most dedicated researchers is coming to the same conclusion, that almost everything is trauma. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Dr. Gabor Mate wrote When the Body Says No. He wrote Hold On to Your Kids. He wrote Close Encounters with Addiction. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris wrote The Deepest Well, Healing the Long-Term Effects of Childhood Adversity, to name some of the more well-known. All these things that have been kicking humanity's butt for so long are simply trauma. And here's why it's so common. Here's why you and I are suffering from these things and why our children are suffering from these symptoms. And it is because trauma can occur anytime a sense of safety is removed. That could be a lot of situations. The potential for trauma is pretty common. It is near constant for some people. When someone feels there's no guarantee of their physical safety, when no one around them can or will protect them, when there is no escape, when they know of no way to get away, they can experience trauma. I have notes just over here to the side. That's why I keep glancing over there. For example, a person is in a terrible car accident, and now they no longer feel safe in cars. They will begin to exhibit one of these symptoms. If a child has a violent or even just a stressful childhood, their sense of safety is lost. They will, guaranteed, begin to exhibit symptoms of trauma. This can also occur when there is a loss of emotional safety. No one here has my back. No one here truly accepts or approves of or loves me. There's no place I can go to get those things. There is no escape from this. I am going to be hurt emotionally, and I know of no way to prevent that, to protect myself, to save myself. Those kind of scenarios regarding physical or emotional safety happen a lot. They happen daily, multiple times a day for some people. There is simply no escaping the potential for trauma. I talk more about that in my series on marriage. But these unsafe moments, unsafe situations can happen in good homes, in homes with careful, loving, well-meaning parents. They can happen in homes with struggling parents. They can happen in school hallways, in classrooms, in locker rooms, in neighborhoods, at friends' houses, at relatives' houses. It can happen in an instant. It happens all the time. It happens innocently. It can happen when a parent or a person means well, but inadvertently, innocently, creates an atmosphere where the child feels a threat, feels danger, feels unsafe. It can happen when there is a sudden traumatic loss. Someone you love dies or is injured or falls ill, especially if it is a child's caregiver. Your mind can begin to believe that the world is physically and emotionally unsafe. And what might traumatize one person might not traumatize another. Here's why. Let's dig deeper into this. Trauma is actually a loss of connection. So, trauma is not the event. Trauma is not the terrible car accident, or the sexual or physical abuse, or the horrors a soldier saw in combat. Those are not the trauma and not even the cause of the trauma. Not the event, not the loss of a sense of safety. Those things are the catalyst. The actual trauma is the loss of connection, which is caused by the response to the event. And let's dig into that. It is pretty common for a child to experience some loss of connection with a parent. Typically, that happens in the first 2 to 3 years of life. Most of the time, the parent does not mean for that to happen. The parent would be heartbroken if they knew that it happened. Remember those 2 responses we talked about earlier. And you can see how that would be common. The parent or parents might be stressed because of the new baby. Maybe it is their first child. Maybe they don't have a lot of support. Maybe they did not have great models and are scared of how they will parent. Or they are stressed out about something else in their life at the time the baby arrives. Maybe war, maybe civil or political unrest, or injustice. Maybe their job is uncertain or unpleasant. Maybe there are relationship problems, maybe family problems, fears. Maybe one or both of the parents are not around. Maybe the parents' own unknown personal trauma. It is possible that some part of the parent resents the baby. In any event, any of those things can cause a loss of connection. The baby or child will quickly, instinctively sense the stress in the parent. They will sense that the connection is not as strong as it could be, even in infancy. The number one greatest human need is connection. There is nothing humans need more than connection. So when connection is lost or frayed, it can be traumatic. You can understand how there might be a lot of humans who have experienced a loss or lack of connection. Now, it is not even loss of connection with others that causes trauma. Trauma is actually loss of connection with yourself. The first greatest need of humans is connection. The second greatest need of humans is authenticity. Are you allowed to be who you truly are? To thine own self be true. Here's an example. A child is born into a good home. There is some stress or tension, as there will be. So there will be tension at times. And the child will instinctively, subconsciously sense when the connection with the parent is not secure. The parent is distracted, the parent is stressed, the parent is absent. The child must have connection to survive. An infant or a child literally cannot physically survive without connection to a caring adult, much less emotionally or mentally survive. So the child performs for the parent. Child becomes a class clown, or the child becomes a peacemaker, or a people pleaser, or the child becomes a jock, because that is the only way the father relates to the child. That is the only time the father interacts with the child, is surrounding athletics. Or the child becomes invisible, never making a scene, never standing up for themselves, never doing anything that would jeopardize the connection with the parent, never angering or upsetting the parent. Or the child acts out and has reckless behavior, because that's the only time they get attention from the parent. Then the child grows up and spends the rest of their life as the class clown, the funny guy, or the people pleaser, or the peacemaker, or obsessed with athletics, or the invisible woman, the dutiful wife, or the reckless person, when that isn't who they really are. Or they at least were so much more than that, and they lost connection with their true self early in life. And they didn't know it. And they never even knew to look for their authentic self. The loss of connection with themselves is the trauma. And the longer the disconnection continues, the greater the symptoms, the greater the suffering. You and I know children who were encouraged to be a certain thing by their parent. And by encouraged, I mean forced. That happens a lot. It happens innocently. The child is steered toward a career that is not truly them. They don't have the interest or the aptitude for it, but they are unable to say what they really want. They are not allowed to be themselves. That is trauma. I talk more about that in my series on finding your path in life. And so in childhood, their little brain comes up with an adaptation, instinctively, quickly, subconsciously, to maintain connection with their parent. In other words, to survive. They have to have that connection. The mind is a survival mechanism. Its primary function is to keep the organism alive, to make sure the heart continues to beat and the lungs continue to breathe, to make sure the organism gets nutrients and water and the other basic needs are met and other more complex needs. Your mind's response to danger, especially prolonged danger, is to adapt. So the child sacrifices who they really are to maintain connection. It is natural and subconscious. The need for connection is so powerful that a child will do anything for the sake of connection, even sacrifice themselves, even sacrifice who they really are. I talk more about that in my video on the themes of literature, which is powerful, life-changing talk. But the loss of connection with yourself is trauma. That's what a midlife crisis is. It is when a person in their 40s or 50s crashes hard into the question, who am I? The question that was never asked and never answered. And finally their mind can't handle it any longer. It is such a common experience that we all know the phrase midlife crisis. You probably didn't know that a midlife crisis is when a person is subconsciously sensing the unbearable terror that they have lost or never knew their true self. But that's what it is. Who am I? The actor and comic Jim Carrey is an amazing example of this. Watch some of his recent videos and recent interviews. He tells this exact story. Another example of separating from yourself could be a soldier witnesses or is a part of horrible things in combat. And shortly after, they cannot believe they saw those things or did those things. That is not them. That's not who they really are. But they cannot stop thinking about what they saw. It's too much. So to deal with the thoughts, memories, images, internal turmoil, they dissociate or become an addict, or their psyche starts to fray. They cannot endure some part of themselves, so they begin to lose connection with themselves. I cannot stand myself. I cannot stand the person that did those things. I cannot stand the person that remembers those things. That is trauma. That is PTSD. Listen to this. There is no such thing as getting used to combat. Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and the duration of their exposure. Thus, psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds in warfare. That's from an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association from 1946. Our veterans are suffering, folks. I don't know how much you know about that. Not all of them are affected or have been affected in the same way, and that is exactly what we've been talking about. But too many of our veterans commit suicide. Too many of our veterans are homeless and lost, and it is trauma that has brought them there. I want to come back to that thought, I can't stand myself, for a moment. If you work with people who have suffered abuse or who have witnessed abuse, the thing that stands out is how low their self-esteem is. They feel worthless. They blame themselves for what happened. In fact, if they are able to dig deeper and really examine themselves, they often discover that they hate themselves. They hate themselves for not fighting back, for not getting away, for not protecting others in the house, for bringing the abuse on themselves, they believe. How heartbreaking is that? That a child gets abused, and instead of thinking less of the abuser, the child's anger, shock, hatred, anguish, torment turns inward, and they think less of themselves. So the process is, A person, and tragically it is typically a child, experiences physical or emotional threat, often in the form of a loss of connection with a parent. And then that person creates adaptations to protect themselves from that danger, or to keep that loss from happening. And then those adaptations cause a loss of connection with themselves, and that is trauma. Some adaptations are ingenious, all of them are desperate and subconscious. Adaptations are what your mind does to relieve yourself of or to ward off traumatic memories, effects, triggers, those sort of things. Eating problems, cutting yourself, suicidal fantasies, addictions, acting out, being a bad kid, daydreaming, etc., etc., etc. Those are adaptations. Those are things the mind does to survive. And they are different based on each person's personality and situation. So you can see how what might traumatize one person might not traumatize another. One person's personality and adaptations might not cause them to lose connection with themselves or to lose it to the same degree. Even chronic illness or pain is an adaptation to trauma. When you are not able to say no, your body will eventually say no for you. Remember the title of Dr. van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, and of that book by Dr. Gabor Mate, When the Body Says No. When you are not able to stand up for yourself or ask for what you want or need or say no to an abuser, your body will eventually say no for you. And you will develop chronic pain and chronic illness. Those are your body's way of saying no when you believe you cannot say no. Believe is the key word there, right? Trauma does three things to people. It causes them to get stuck in the past. A person gets frozen, as it were, in the time when the trauma occurred. And second thing is people become alienated from their own bodies. That's kind of what we were talking about with the chronic pain and the chronic illness. Become disconnected with their own selves, their own physical body. And people become stuck in fight or flight. Because they are stuck in the trauma, the brain keeps signaling that the world is a dangerous place. And so the person cannot rest or relax. Their mind stays hypervigilant at all times. And eventually, because of that, the mind and the body begin to break down. I want to talk about questions and objections. Because some people might think, oh man, one more thing for people to diagnose themselves with and whine about. And if you think that, you make a good point. We don't want people whining at all, much less more. But that's part of the good news. This new understanding of trauma gives us less things to whine and worry about. We do not have to whine and worry about all those symptoms that have been an absolute plague on humanity and that we cannot seem to shake no matter how many pills we take. And we should not whine or worry about those things because they are simply symptoms of the real problem, trauma. And we can fix that. You might think, I don't know, I don't like the idea of giving people an excuse for their behaviors. I don't know if I like the idea of telling people it's not your fault, it's the trauma. I don't like the idea of coddling people and saying, oh, poor you, you had a tough childhood. Welcome to the club. Most of us have difficulty in childhood. You might think, do we really want people passing or dodging responsibility for their own behavior? We don't want people blaming their parents or other people for their own mistakes, their own habits, their own suffering, or whatever. And if you think that, you make a good point. We absolutely do not want to remove responsibility. In fact, we probably should never keep our children from facing natural consequences, even though that can be heartbreaking sometimes. Babying, coddling people certainly isn't good for them. But we want and need resilience, toughness, responsibility. Those things are necessary in life, not optional, not just desirable if you can get them, or okay for some people if that's your thing. But resilience, responsibility, toughness, those things are necessary. Pointing out the problem, which is trauma, is infinitely better than what we've been doing, which is either pretending we don't have problems, which is absurd, or medicating the life out of ourselves, or suffering in secret, or having almost 50,000 people a year take their own lives. In America alone, trauma is the single greatest public health issue on the planet. But we now know how to treat it, and we know how to prevent it. We are not pretending to eliminate suffering, or saying we have the potential to eliminate suffering, or even saying we want to eliminate all suffering. Life is suffering. That's the foundation of Buddhism. Life and suffering are inseparable. If you are alive, you are going to experience difficulty. Indeed, it is difficulty, stress, and pain that cause growth. We must accept reality, seeing as we live in it, and the reality is that suffering is a part of life. The key word there is part. For some people, trauma, or the effects of it, consume their entire existence. And that is what we've been talking about. No thanks. What I'm excited about is healing and preventing unnecessary suffering. And I know a little bit about that. You'll experience pain when growing and learning, but you do not have to stay in distress. You had a runny nose and sore throat at some point in childhood, but you do not have a runny nose and sore throat the rest of your life. That would make life unnecessarily difficult. Your muscles were sore after a good workout, but they do not stay sore the rest of your life. Technically, when your muscles are sore, it is because of micro tears in the tissue. And when those tears heal, your muscles get stronger. If you don't let them heal, you can cause greater and greater tears in the tissue and do irreparable damage. The same applies to trauma. Another objection people might have is you might think, I'm going to be tough on my kid to make them tough. That is an extremely dangerous game. If we were to gather any number of people together whose parents did that to them, what we would find is that all of them, every single one of those people, are suffering profoundly from trauma, and they've passed that on to their own kids, who will pass that on to their kids. Your foolishness and arrogance will have profound, negative, exponential consequences for generations. It is essentially saying to your child, I want you to suffer. I want life to be unnecessarily difficult for you. I want you to live in confusion and pain, and I want all of your relationships to suffer needlessly. Would you say that to your child? Would you want that for your child? So, if you think, I'm going to be tough on my kid to make them tough, what is actually happening when you do that, I'm going to be extra tough on my kid, my house is going to be flipping Bud's SEAL training school, you are causing trauma. And I can go a little further with this. If you say or think that sort of thing, it is your own personal trauma talking. Remember, be compassionate with yourself. Think of that scene from Good Will Hunting. You are acting out of your own trauma. So the solution is not to traumatize your own children, for God's sake, but to address your own trauma and thereby save your children from unnecessary suffering, from debilitating suffering, from life-threatening suffering. Knowing what you now know about trauma, you can see the problem. Punishment, anger, harshness, overreacting, manipulating, all of those things break relationship. That's what they do. And it is that very loss of connection that ends up causing trauma. The exciting part is that we are just at the crest of the wave in understanding trauma, in understanding its effects, in understanding how to treat it and how to prevent it. This will radically transform our lives. Imagine our schools. Teachers need to hear this information, first for themselves and then for their students. If all of the problematic behaviors, all of them, in our schools are simply symptoms of trauma, imagine how many people's lives we can transform. There are so many students who struggle, silently, needlessly, desperately, in ways they don't understand and could not articulate. It's all trauma, and we can help. The education industry is constantly shopping for lightning, as I call it. At times it feels like a mad scramble to find the next program that will solve our current greatest problem. And then if that program does not produce dramatic enough results, or if it does, and now some new problem becomes the next greatest problem, then the frenzied search starts all over again. It can be frustrating and exhausting for teachers and staff when a new complex program is mandated and implemented just as they were getting comfortable with the last one. Sweeping changes are always disruptive. Surely this next program will solve the problems that rock our students. Never mind, this new one will. Never mind, it's actually this next new one. And so on. On one hand, shopping for lightning is the appropriate response. It may seem reckless or unwarranted or for show sometimes, but it is evidence of care. When we care about students, we will look for whatever will help them succeed. But imagine the possibilities and potential of even just acknowledging trauma in our students. If trauma is the cause of essentially every problem our students face, imagine what would happen if we were able to simply acknowledge trauma. Or if we were able to at least understand that trauma is the root, and therefore we're able to meet problematic behaviors with compassion and understanding and clarity and truth. Imagine if we finally, for the first time, address the problem instead of the symptoms. An understanding of trauma, even just an acknowledgement of it, could transform our schools and our home and our world profoundly. And, it must be said, if we do not acknowledge the reality of trauma, we will continue to be frustrated and heartbroken by the symptoms, and we will struggle to help the students that are struggling. Trauma researchers and doctors have identified several treatments for trauma. For many, many decades, the consensus in the mental health field was that there was no cure for trauma. The best you could do was learn to cope with the symptoms. But now we know more, and they have identified treatments that heal. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. Vanderkolk discusses a bunch of therapies that are super effective. And you really owe it to yourself to read that book. One of the therapies, he says, that is profoundly effective is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And that's where a therapist moves their fingers back and forth, and the participant follows it with their eyes, and then a skilled, trained therapist asks certain questions and follow-up questions. And Dr. van der Kolk talks about how we don't know why it works, and we don't know what it's doing, but it works. Another therapy is internal family systems, IFS, and in that book, The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. van der Kolk tells some heartbreaking stories. Are happy ending stories, but still heartbreaking, of people going through that therapy. There is psychomotor therapy, meditation, yoga, theater, dance, karate, activities that reconnect a person with their body and reconnect a person with that part of them that is stuck in the past. There's a therapy called neurofeedback. We don't necessarily need more medication. We don't need more superstition or mythology. We certainly don't need more punishment. We simply need this understanding of trauma. We simply need to hear this truth. And I want to come back to where we began. The single greatest public health issue on the planet is trauma. The most urgent, most important health issue on the planet is trauma. You are affected by trauma. Some of you have been devastated by trauma, but you don't have to be anymore. Thank you for watching this. I hope it changes your life, or you can share it with someone whose life it will change. Don't hesitate to share, like, or comment.